I'm excited to be here. This is a really fun opportunity to be able to come back to BYU, and it's a place I think in San Diego. There's a lot of love for BYU, and it's highly idealized, and everyone has BYU stickers on their cars and things like that. Brad actually came down and visited down there. How long was that, Brad?
Last year.
Last year, yeah. So, anyways, but it is really exciting to be here. Today I'm going to present a little bit of my research, and I am going to go over a little bit of background on what I research, because I know that some of you know me, some of you are familiar with the work I do, but many of you haven't had the time to dig into it into a full level. The focus today will be narcissism and leadership, and I'll explain, why I look at narcissism. Isn't that kind of a strange topic in just a moment? So if you want to say, who are you? What's your central identity? I'm a leadership researcher. So that's really the focus of all the work, or the majority of the work that I do. I've been involved in projects in lots of different areas, right? So I'm early in the doctoral program and still ongoing. I've been involved with some neuroscience and leadership projects, done quite a bit of development and learning, and published in these areas. But if you think about where I'm if you want to understand kind of where I'm going on a going forward basis, it's really on this side of the diagram. Areas like identity are really important to me in narcissism. And then frequently these intersections, right? So how does a narcissistic leader influence follower perceptions, let's say in the way they communicate? Or how does identity of an individual who happens to be narcissistic influence the way that they'll then engage in leadership, things like that. So although I'm a leadership researcher, I like to bring in lots of different areas of research. And Dave Wetten's isn't here today, but I thought I'd bring back a memory. The first time I met him, everyone had asked if I knew Dave Wetten. I went to BYU, and I said, actually, I don't. He had been, I think he was over doing some administrative work the years that I was here. And I had the opportunity to meet him at an academy party, and I went up and shook his hand and said, I'm Ben Galvin. And he said, what do you research? And I said, leadership. And he said, I don't think there's anything interesting left in that area, or something along those lines. I realize now he's probably joking, but at the time it was like a knife in the stomach. But really, yeah. So anyway, so hopefully I've been able to uncover some interesting ideas related to leadership. So why narcissism? Early in my doctoral program, I was called into a meeting in a boardroom just like this, and we sat down and we were doing some neuroscience research. And they said one of the things we want to look at is manipulation and deception in conversation. And so that sounds great. And next thing I know, I was the deception expert when we meet with companies to collect data for, put the neuroscience caps on their head. And I thought, I'm a first-year doctoral student. I'm not really an expert in this topic, so I think that's deception of itself. But quickly we realized that narcissism was related to deception. And as we started to look at it more closely, it became fairly interesting as the conversations went on. This data collection effort, this isn't part of the neuroscience data, but it was collected at a similar time. We were going into to meeting with executives, and they realized we were playing these roles, but we'd play the role of like a newspaper reporter or a union representative, and then we'd walk through different scenarios with them, have them role play kind of what would happen. They were to pretend as if this was a real situation, and we'd have them share their visions and things like that. As we looked at narcissists, we started hypothesizing that these people will be very bold in their visions, along with the theories that related to narcissism. But not only that, but that they would also be less socialized in the way they communicated. So it would really be all about me and not about the group as a whole. And what we hypothesized and then found support for was that it was really a mixed bag. So that was kind of my initial foray into narcissism research. And then the summer after I graduated, I love to read biographies of famous leaders, whether in the church or out of the church. And some of the individuals that summer I was reading a lot about Frank Lloyd Wright. And it was exciting to see all the amazing things he did, and the groundbreaking changes he brought to architecture. But it was completely disturbing to read about his personal life and the way he treated other people, and just kind of the disregard for people's futures. And so in starting to see that, I realized, whoa, this is something that needs to be talked about more in organizations because it's so prevalent at the tops of organizations. Then about a year later, Steve Jobs passed away, and I had the opportunity to read his biography, and the exact same patterns emerged, right? So you have this brilliant individual who's extremely bold and risk-taking, but then you look at this path of disaster around them, right? They're throwing everyone under the bus, not developing individuals, and really all about themselves. And so at that point, I realized this is an area that's interesting to delve further into. For those of you who are thinking, we've been saying narcissism, but I still don't even really know what you're talking about. This is a nice picture to, the narcissist, kind of from Greek mythology, this idea of self-love, really seeing yourself as superior to other people, a disregard for others' feelings, low empathy, things like that. And the idea kind of underlying is that I not only see myself as superior to other people, but I really have a strong need to justify that sense to others. So I'm always doing things to try to help other people for them to see me in the same way that I see myself in this really inflated way. As far as looking at general tendencies and stuff, so things like entitlement tend to be very narcissistic. A need to be special and wield power, a feeling of arrogance and envy. And it tends to be very prevalent at the upper echelons of organizations. So one of the questions I'm interested in is, why is that? Why do narcissists tend to emerge at the tops of organizations? And there's different reasons for that. And I'll talk about some of those, but just kind of briefly, if you think about the types of behaviors that allow people, and especially for-profit organizations, to emerge as leaders, a lot of times it's being bold and risk-taking, taking charge, things like that. But there's also a lot of costs to leading. So for instance, there's personal costs, time costs, things that really affect other people. So if you have low empathy for others, you're more likely to take on those roles. So it's an interesting mixed bag here.
So Ben, I'm curious. I heard the first part of the definition of narcissism, which I think we all sort of understand, that self-love, but right. I wasn't familiar with the theoretical notion that
right.
you also had to expend time and effort to make sure other people also saw that.
So if you look at the academic literature, and this is true in our papers as well, at first I think it's like we all went out and read the narcissism research really quickly. And then we conceptualized it and say, hey, it's about people thinking they're superior, and exhibitionist type people. But then as you go back and read that literature in a deeper way, you start to see there's like this level of insecurity there, right? So that's kind of where.
So the idea that not only is it self-love, but the need to have other people also.
Right. So other people are kind of.
That was in the original research.
Right. So that's where. Yeah. I mean, it depends how far you want to get back. Freud.
But it's been around for a long time.
But it's been around for a long time. Okay. This isn't a contribution or anything like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So although a lot of my research. A lot of it actually does directly involve narcissism. A lot of it is looking at this idea of self-focus versus other focus. And here's kind of some examples. Publications, I talked about this paper here a second ago. The paper that, so let's see. Yeah. So this is the one where we looked at CEOs and kind of the way they communicated and what do people tend to find inspiring. They tend to find bold visions inspiring. But if you weren't about the collective, if you're just about yourself, it wasn't inspiring at all. And then in this paper here, we look at servant leadership. And what we hypothesize now as it relates to narcissism is that it would be a negative predictor. So we were proposing that servant leadership was this really important form of leadership that's really going to benefit organizations, but that you can't be self-focused when you're doing that. You have to be aware of those around you. You have to be aware of their needs and interests and things like that in order to then be inspiring and be able to help those people develop. And in this paper, we actually tied servant leadership to firm performance, which is interesting, but at the same time also acknowledging that it could be somewhat of an artifact of the data, that I think that there's so much that goes on between CEO behaviors and actual performance of firms. Some other work, I'm going to present this paper today. I'm also looking at narcissism and leader entrepreneurial intentions. We're also doing a paper looking at inclusive leadership. And the idea behind that is if you're more other focused, more of a humility focus, that you're going to be much more effective in bringing other people into what you're doing. If you're all about yourself, it's very difficult to then to see the strengths and weaknesses of other people and then learn how to incorporate them effectively. I'm also doing some work looking at building off some empirical work, building off the surrogates AMR, which is this idea that leader influence is highly a lot of leader influence can be tied back to social networks and organizations and the social processes that occur there. And so what we're saying in this is that if you look at informal leaders, that they then can influence the way that the leader is perceived. And so we're actually testing that with network nominations and things like that. I also have some work that's ongoing. So looking at CEO decision making. So opportunities where there's technological change and how do CEOs react to that. So what were our propositions in that are, that's actually under review. But the propositions in that basically are centered around this idea that if you're a narcissist, you're gonna escalate commitment to your current strategy. It's gonna be difficult to admit that you're wrong, and that you're just gonna kind of keep on trying to do the same thing. So there's lots of examples out there, but something like Blockbuster, externally it seems pretty apparent that there should have been faster change that occurred, but internally that wasn't taking place. But what we're saying is if you're humble though, that you'd be more likely to admit that the strategy was failing and change your strategy. However, the kind of counterintuitive tweak though is that if the individual happens to be if they're not responsible for the current strategy, so if you're a narcissist and someone else came up with the strategy, that you'd quickly be able to be willing to move on because it's kind of bringing down your image. And that you probably want to pursue very bold strategies. And finally, in this paper, we're looking at singular leadership. So the premise of this paper is this idea that so much of leadership research now is really moving in the idea of shared leadership, and the individual is being taken out of it. So CEOs are evil. We should basically move in the direction towards the Arab Spring of leadership, or Occupy movements, and have leaderless movements. That leaders are bringing us down and really too controlling and things like that. What we're saying is, there are some leaders who have that effect on groups. There's some bad CEOs out there, but there's a lot of other leaders that are highly effective, that do a lot for organizations, and that really promote people being empowered and moving forward, and really allow for sustainable outcomes. So, this is a little flavor of some of the things I'm working on. But I want to move on to the presentation of the research paper. So this is a paper that I've been working quite a bit on the last few weeks. It was recently conditionally accepted at AMR, and we just resubmitted. So it's not going back out to the reviewers, which we're very happy about. We had awesome reviewers, but they were ready to move on. So as you look out in the news media, you see lots of CEOs getting in trouble, or leaders of organizations getting in trouble for unethical behavior. The interesting thing, though, is that many times it seems like they actually care about the organization. So when I worked in retail for Macy's, one of the companies that we frequently talk about was Martha Stewart, right? So she has this huge organization making lots of money, and then makes a decision that then would undermine the entire organization for a seemingly small amount of money. It seems completely irresponsible. How could you think that would be something that would be appropriate, right? Or other examples, so the Regas family. So you have this family making a lot of money with Adelphi Communication, giving their lives, their blood, sweat, and tears, so here's some quotes. They were running it as if it were the kingdom of the Regases and not a public corporation. They treated Adelphia like it was a family business that was theirs and theirs alone to run as they pleased. They said attorneys for John Regas said that the case had near tragic overtones for a man who spent his life building a company. So there's this identification component that they really care about these organizations, and they're willing to give a lot on behalf of them, but at the end of the day, they do things that undermine them. And so that's not how this paper started, but this is the phenomenon that we're trying to look at. How do you explain this? Did you have much?
I just want to make sure conceptually. So in the case of Martha Stewart, what she did was actually unrelated to the company, right? So in this case, what they were doing was directly related to.
Right. So the idea being, when Martha Stewart, so she has this public company, when she engages in this behavior, all of a sudden a lot of people are dropping their betting lines, right? So even though it's not necessarily a business act, when you're that public, everything you do could have consequences for the organization. Yeah, for the brand. So, but I agree with what you're saying. It's a really, they're separate in a way.
So it's a different kind. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
So unethical. Are you making claims about this is narcissism as well, or is this tying
Well, so it will be tied into this, yeah. So the idea is going to be that these individuals there's a level of narcissism here, right, that's kind of feeding this behavior.
It's usually thought of as an individual characteristic rather than a shared group characteristic, like that last example.
Yeah, so this last example is family. There's a patriarch here, and at the end of the conversation, I'll talk about how does family influence this actual behavior. Does it actually benefit it? Does it make it so that the narcissistic tendencies are held at bay? Or does it actually make it worse? So in this case, you could make the argument it made it worse, that there's a family firm here. And Gibb and I were actually talking about this a little bit earlier today. And then you see stuff like this from Jeffrey's feeling, I am Enron, right? So there's a sense that I am the organization. If you start to think about explanations, how do you explain this type of behavior? It's counterintuitive. These people care about the organization. They give so much on behalf, and then they do things to undermine the same thing that they've spent so much of their life building up. You can look at things like agency theory and say, these are just dishonest executives, pursuing personal gains. But it doesn't really get at this idea that, hey, then why are they simultaneously giving above and beyond? Why are they sacrificing their lives to build these organizations that they then undermine? So these aren't necessarily an agent that was brought into the organization, right? In narcissism, you could say, well, the simple explanation is these are just narcissists. But at the end of the day, once again, a narcissist is going to just act on their behalf. They're going to build up the organization to a certain extent, but not the extent that you're seeing here. And this is really where the foundation of this idea came from, is as I was reading it in this time period, so about 2011, 2012, there was a lot of narcissism work coming out, and simultaneously there was work coming out, so looking at narcissistic CEOs, and then there's work also coming out looking at organizational identification at the CEO level. So you look at Chatterjee and Hamrick, it's all about me, right? And this is a paper probably some of you are familiar with, but this idea that the narcissists are going to take bold and risky actions. We published a paper, as I mentioned, looking at narcissists and visionary communication. Both me and colleagues looking at, me or we. So it's interesting, look how similar this is. It's all about me or me or we, and they're looking at organizational identification and how that has positive outcomes for the organizations. And then Chatterjee and Hamrick again following up. In this paper, we actually looked at organizational identification. That narcissism, it appears that they are less likely to identify with the organizations, and that then there's these negative outcomes. So as these papers are coming together, there's this idea kind of emerged. And for review, I know a lot of you.
Ben, sorry, if you're going to get to this, you can just tell me to wait. I'm not completely convinced by your dismissal of agency theory yet.
Okay.
It could be, even if Martha Stewart just didn't think she was going to get caught.
Right.
She takes every advantage she can, and occasionally she gets caught, but usually she doesn't.
So it's kind of part of the picture, right? But but agency theory doesn't explain kind of why do they then engage kind of in these above and beyond behaviors, right? That are above their personal benefits. So if you could do some sort of a economic analysis and say, okay, in which we obviously can't, but if you put in this much effort, your stock price is going to raise this much. Your benefits, your contract is going to be benefited in this way. But then, why are these individuals going above and beyond, right? This idea of like near tragic overtones for someone who's given their life to something. You look at like a Steve Jobs, right? When he did things that could undermine, potentially undermine an organization. What was going on there? Was it really, is agency a good explanation for that? So it's not that agency doesn't still play in the story, but just by itself, it doesn't really explain behavior. Does that help a little bit, or still not convinced?
Well, I'll be interested to see where you go with this. I'm not convinced that you can make the case that these over and above efforts weren't economically beneficial.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Or even personally beneficial, right? I mean, all you need for agency theory to work is for the personal benefits to be aligned with the organizational benefits.
Right.
And they will work above and beyond only for themselves, and the organization happens to benefit.
So you work.
And then something comes out of alignment, and suddenly the governance mechanisms don't work either, and the organization is damaged by the pursuit of self.
Yeah, that's it.
But the good might have been pursuit of self the whole time, and that's an agency problem.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's an agency element here, but just like identification by itself doesn't explain it, or agency theory by itself doesn't explain it, but there's something kind of a missing there, I guess. But apparently I haven't convinced both of you guys.
You can move forward. We'll see.
We'll move forward. But I think it's it's a good challenge, and it's something we've thought of quite a bit about. I'll move forward and we'll see what you think. So just as a review of what organizational identification is, so it's this, and I label it here conventional organizational identification, but this idea that the perceived identity of the organization and then the identity of the individual, there's an overlap there. And so as those identities overlap, the individual tends to start to highly identify with the organization. So for instance, if I work at BYU and it starts to become central to who I am, then I have a high level of organizational identification. Whereas, if I just work here, collect a check, don't really care about BYU, it's not important to my identity, my organizational identification is very low. So that's just on a really basic level. And it tends to lead to behaviors that are on behalf of the organization. So OCB type, organizational citizenship type behaviors. I'm going to do more for the organization than I'm getting paid for because of the fact that I care so much about this organization. It's really important to who I am. Another construct that you could also look at, though, and obviously organizational identification is related to these positive behaviors, not to these negative behaviors. You could also look at something like over-identification. This is just an example of over-identification. But interestingly, so this is the idea that the individual's identity is consumed by the identity of the organization in their mind. So my whole life is the organization I work for. That's all I care about. I lose kind of who I am as an individual. This is related to these negative behaviors when the individual thinks they're acting on behalf of the organization. So let's say I engage in an unethical behavior, but I think I'm trying to save my boss so that they don't get in trouble because I care so much about who they are, what they're doing. But for the most part, though, it's really related to this kind of like above and beyond effort. It's not related to this mixed bag of behaviors.
This fits in with your research, John, right? I mean, John shows the more you identify with the organization, the more likely is you're going to do unethical behavior on behalf of the organization.
Right. So, but not necessarily, yeah. Do I need to explain more?
Yes, please explain.
No, I mean to justify what I say research.
No, I think we've got it. Unless anybody else has questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, but it's important to, and this is, I don't know if this is the way you guys look at it, but this idea of this figure here, that it's in the mind of the individual, their identity becomes really small, and that it's consumed by the organization.
We don't look at it in those terms. I mean, I don't know that it's subsumed within the organization, but rather that if you're looking at the Venn, when there's a high degree of overlap, the higher the degree of overlap, the more likely you're going to be to identify in a way that justifies certain behaviors that otherwise would consider kind of morally or ethically. And
this is really one of the contributions we're seeking to make is this idea of kind of taking a more fine-grained approach, right?
Yeah.
If you picture yourself, this idea that identities could become more important than other, one identity can become more important than the other in the mind of the individual. So it's not that the identity of the organization literally consumes that person, but in their mind, their identity basically becomes less important or almost obsolete for them.
So is this idea of over-identification, is that a novel contribution?
No, but I'm just saying this little, this diagram, and you'll see why we're diagramming it this way because the way that we diagram narcissistic organizational identification. And then the idea of ambivalent identification, we don't need to spend too much time here, but this idea that sometimes it's really important to identity and other times it's not important. And it also wouldn't be a good explanation for the types of behaviors we're looking at. So the idea here is, hey, is there some sort of black box that we're missing? And the idea is that CEO narcissistic organizational identification really captures this for us. This idea that, hey, something's going on here that then leads to these self-serving behaviors as well as organizational serving behaviors. And so now let's get to narcissistic organizational identification. Here you can see why we bring out over-identification, but it's really the opposite, right? So instead of the individual seeing their identity consumed by the organization, they see their identity as consuming the identity of the organization. So I'm bigger than the organization, it's part of me. So here's the actual definition. The individual sees her identity as central to the identity of the organization, resulting in the individual perceiving the organization's identity as being secondary and subsumed. And so in the mind of the individual, that organization's identity is diminished relative to the individual's identity, as the individual sees an element of extension of himself. So the organization, they start to say, hey, it's just part of me. I'm so much bigger than this. It's just part of who I am. And here's a diagram. Some of you might be thinking, how is that different from psychological ownership? We're actually going to propose psychological ownership as an antecedent when combined with narcissism in a minute. But the psychological ownership is more about seeing the target of the ownership as theirs. It's more possessive feelings. It's more about the organization being mine, not I. Right? So if I'm Steve Jobs and I think of Apple, I don't necessarily think of it as a possession in that way, but it's just part of who I am, right? Or at one point he probably felt that way. Later on in his career, that probably not so much.
But then that makes sense. I mean, Steve Jobs built the company. It was literally his. Right. So is it narcissism, or is it over identification, or is it reality?
So I think it's a good point. And I'll use I'm teaching the Doctrine and Covenants in seminary right now. So let's talk about like Joseph Smith, for instance, because we could hopefully agree that he's not an extreme narcissist. So here's an individual who, to everyone else on the outside, he founded the organization. I'm talking about to the outside world. People really saw him central to the organization, but hopefully he never saw the organization that way, right? It's not part of who I am. I'm part of what it is, right? It's something bigger than I am. So it's this idea that a humble individual or someone low in narcissism isn't going to subsume the identity of the organization in that same way. So it's different than saying like, hey, it's related to what you're doing. Obviously people, you can think of lots of organizations where people associate that person with the organization. And these are actually the antecedents that we're going to be that I'm going to look at or bring up in a second. But it's a good point that I think it's somewhat natural process. But when you really step back and think about it, you can think of quite a few examples where there's a founder of an organization who remains extremely humble and doesn't really see all these 2,000 people who work for them and working towards building this something bigger than themselves. They haven't subsumed it in the same way. Is that?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it makes sense, but you're definitely going to find this with founder CEOs.
Right.
So you think of like Sam Walton. I mean, even the name of the company, for crying out loud, has
Walmart, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's associated with his identity.
But also, I guess so one of the things I push back on is the types of people who are likely to go out and found these huge organizations also probably tend to be somewhat narcissistic, right? So there's quite a few examples of I'm going to found this humongous organization and call it my own name. It's like maybe they didn't know it at that point that it was going to be a huge organization, but so that's kind of plays into it. Okay, but so traditionally, if you look at Bovie and all, you start to, and actually one of my co-authors, Don, I should have mentioned at the beginning, Blake and Don Lang are both on this paper with me. And this is something that's been a labor of love over time, and we've had many phone calls, and it's all been done long distance, but it's been a really fun paper. But Don was actually working on this paper with Steve Bovie, and in this they looked at CEO perceptions. And what really leads to organizational identification. What they uncovered, they were looking at more specific variables, but the type of thing that they were looking at was this idea of if I have influence and control over the organization, I'm then more likely to identify with it. If I feel like I have some discretion. So think about your classroom. If you're told exactly what you need to do, you have to use this textbook, you have to use this syllabus. No discretion, it's less likely that then you're going to say, like, this is really my, class that I care a lot about, and my identity starts to overlap to, if we're looking at an organization. So if I have influence and control, it leads to conventional organizational identification. If I have a level of psychological ownership, right? So if I feel that even if I don't actually own the organization, then I'm going to care more about it. The identities are going to overlap. And then if others hold the organization in high regard, right? So if BYU has an amazing football season, it's probably really fun to be a professor here. It's probably more part of your identity. You probably have more stickers on your car. In really bad seasons, maybe the stickers start coming off and things like that. And then in addition to that, whether others identify the organization in terms of him or her. So this is going back to that idea that, hey, if you're a founder of an organization, and people really see you as an important part of that organization, your identity is going to overlap highly with the organization. So these are the antecedents that they found that lead to conventional organizational identification. What we're saying is there's a range of high levels of organizational identification. At one end, you're going to have over-identification, and this doesn't portray that full spectrum there. You're going to have, and then you're going to have conventional identification and then high narcissistic organizational identification. When you have a narcissistic CEO, those antecedents are going to combine with narcissism to create narcissistic organizational identification. If you have low narcissism, then or more average levels that you're going to see in the general population of CEOs, you're going to get conventional organizational identification. And here's kind of like a big picture of this continuum that I just was speaking about. And the idea here is that if you have neutral organizational identification, in the presence of narcissism, the narcissistic, conventional, and then we don't actually hypothesize this or have propositions about this in our paper, but you could look at something like core self-evaluations, right? If someone has really low core self-evaluations, they're more likely to over-identify with the organization. And John probably has some other things that he could put in there to kind of enhance that. But this isn't really central. This is really the focus here of the paper.
Can I ask you a question? So one of the things I'm finding interesting, and I don't know this literature, I suspect that in the field of psychology, narcissism is very much defined as a pathology of an individual.
Right.
And one of the things I see you doing repeatedly, right from the beginning with your example, the family organizations, your antecedents, is that you are acknowledging that narcissistic identification with an organization can involve other people who help to bring that about. And so it becomes more of a social accomplishment rather than an individual pathology. Have you gotten any pushback on that, or is that
so
not
more
a
it's just
problem?
something we've handled in future directions, but it's really taking place in the mind of the individual. So it's perceptions of the world, right? So there might be a lot of people telling you that you're this great person and that the organization's really all about you. The media might be telling you that. Your followers might even be telling you that. So there's definitely social processes going on. Really, we're trying to kind of introduce a construct, kind of lay it out theoretically, but we hope though that people are going to then go back and say, hey, just like over-identification or conventional identification, that what's really going on here? What social processes are at play? Is that kind of does that help at all? Or?
Yeah. So okay. I guess you're.
So we're just kind of like taking the first bite, right? And then we're hoping that then people will jump on this and really run with it. But I'll talk about some of the future directions. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that you can look at. Other comments? So although this model isn't in the paper, just for simplicity, this is the basic idea, that you have these antecedents in combination with CEO narcissism will lead to narcissistic organizational identification, will then lead to self-serving behaviors such as, I'll walk through all this, but and then as well as organization-serving behaviors. So the first hypothesis is basically, or the proposition one is basically that when you have individuals who have these perceptions of influence and control, instead of just leading to these positive outcomes, or instead of just helping me to feel more engaged with the organization, in the presence of narcissism, that things will really kind of go awry. So starting to see yourself as the critical driving force in the organization. Really that your influence and the things that you're doing are really key to what the organization is all about. So really going back to this idea of it's all about me. So relative to individuals with lower levels of narcissism, narcissistic individuals are more likely to identify or to develop a narcissistic identification rather than conventional organizational identification.
Just curious, do you think there's something about CEOs that is this story only a CEO story, or could this happen at lower levels?
So in the review process, it went back and forth between, we originally had a CEO story, and then they were really interested in, like, isn't this more of a general phenomenon, not even about organizations, but couldn't you subsume the identity of a child or things like that? So we, at the end of the day, we opted to stay with the CEO context, but there's definitely different contexts. You could think about, I'll say a dean, because we have a department head here. But a dean could narcissistically identify with a star performer in their organization, right? That person's just kind of part of my identity. Or it could be your administrative assistant. You kind of almost don't even see them as having their own identity, right? It's just kind of part of who you are. They're just kind of your arm. You could also look at non-CEOs. So you could have a sales representative for I don't know if Comcast is here, but Comcast, and they're out and about, right? And they start to see themselves as the organization. I have quite a few times I've had CEOs come into class quite a bit, but I've had kind of second in charge or third in charge and fourth in charge, and all of a sudden they're talking as if they are the organization, right? So you start to say like, well, wait a minute, you aren't Jack in the Box. You're an individual working in Jack in the Box, right? But they start to see themselves that way. At least in their mind, you can see it happening as they're talking. Other questions at all? All right. So the proposition 2, this whole idea of psychological ownership. So, traditionally this is going to lead to these positive behaviors. So if I have high psychological ownership of an idea or, an organization, I'm going to be more likely to act on its behalf and try to, kind of develop that and build it. But in the context of, for a narcissistic individual, this self-focus and grandiosity, you're going to start to see that it signifies less of this convergence of the identity, but more, hey, this is really, once again, kind of part of who I am. These propositions are obviously, all highly related. But the sense again that I'm central to what the organization is, and as you can see the proposition, that relative to others with lower narcissism, the narcissistic individuals are likely to then to subsume the identity of the organization within their own. And then as other people start to see the organization in a really positive light, you're more likely, obviously, to then, as we talked about, overlap the identity of the organization with your own. However, thinking about like a basking and reflected glory effect, so the Cialdini work, what's really going on there? I don't really want other people to see just the organization as great, right? I'm gonna bring that within my own identity. I'm gonna to bring the organization in my own identity and kind of claim that glory for myself. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been at a party or something like that where someone's saying something really positive about BYU. You might feel a positive sense, right? That this makes me feel good. I identify with the organization. But then there could be that, what we're talking about here more is that all of a sudden, hey, like we start seeing that as like, hey, that's my accomplishment, right? It's then building up my own self-image again.
You saw me score that touchdown Saturday.
Yeah. It was all done. And then proposition 4. So this idea that with CEO perceptions, others identify the organization in terms of him or her, right? So going back to this idea that if I'm listening to a news story, and they say, let's say going to the example of Walmart, Sam Walton, just launched 300 more stores. Well, there's a lot of other people involved there. There's a lot of ownership in there. So when you start hearing those things, it could make you feel really good, overlap, create higher levels of identification. But the narcissist is going to say, yeah, it really was all about me. Even though I didn't actually, go visit any of those stores, although I didn't help with any of the setups in the stores that took place, I didn't hire anybody directly. None of this could have been possible without, the work that I've been doing without, So there's an element of truth there, but there's this element of self-deception as well, right? So really subsuming it. And so in this case, again, that I'm not going to read through this, but the higher levels are going to obviously, one of the interesting things that we really struggle with. So as we're talking, one of the things that's kind of been challenging for me is a lot of the comments you guys would bring up are things we spent like a lot of times with reviewers on it. So working through it, I'm constantly thinking like, how did we handle that? What was the paper like before? But in this case, specifically with narcissism, it's important that we don't see it necessarily just as a context, right? This is a stable personality trait that tends to be established according, to this, to the field that, hey, this is something that started probably in early childhood, high school years, things like that, and then continued on. So it's not that the person suddenly becomes narcissistic because they're hearing all these positive things about them. They're already in that place, and it's just making it kind of worse. At one point, we also had hubris in the paper. We were looking at kind of more of a state-like situation as well as a trait. In this case, though, we feel like it's the most appropriate to really look at narcissism. It's more of a long-term thing. But definitely the idea that people could tend to be more narcissistic, or they could be seen more by others as they get in these positions is accurate.
I'm curious about the choice of calling this construct CEO narcissistic organizational identification. Because it seems like what I think is so cool about what you're doing is you're looking at the ratio of self to organization.
Right.
I mean, we always look at them as equal, and it's the overlap.
Right.
But part of what you're looking at is the ratio.
Right.
And so I don't know that.
Yeah. So this is really just, but in the paper it's just narcissistic organizational identification. In fact, sometimes we refer to it just as narcissistic identification. But there is another form of narcissistic identification that's used like in political theory and stuff. So we try to be a little bit careful there.
But it just seems like that label kind of clouds the contribution of what you're doing.
You mean the narcissism part or the CEO part?
I just feel like part of what it seems like you're doing is you're taking the concept, you're adding the moderator, and then you're calling this the antecedent plus the moderator equals the
Yeah. So we went back and originally it was called hyper-identification, but that was the term I came up with originally. But the argument is that just sounds like an extreme form of over-identification. So how do you get at this idea that subsuming, the identification of the organization? So, I mean, there could be a better term for it out there. But really, I think the biggest contribution of this paper is really what you're talking about, looking at identification overlap or identity overlap in a different way. And that's why we try to bring over-identification into that, is that this idea that it does seem like sometimes in the mind of individuals, one identity becomes more important than the other identity.
Right. And I think that's really cool.
Thanks.
So what's the relationship between this concept and narcissistic personality disorder?
So, okay, so, like how is it different or?
And the same.
So what I would say is that this is this general, narcissism is this general orientation. It's a general way of seeing the world. This is an outcome, or in this case we're saying, once again, go back to your comments, but this is actually, when interacting with other variables, it's an outcome of narcissism. So just as maybe, let's say, high core self or low core self-evaluations, that's not really said in this paper, but that could be highly related to individuals then seeing their identity as subsumed within the organization's identity. So I think what Jeff's hitting on, and maybe Kristen's hitting on as well, is it gets a little bit confusing because there's the word narcissism's in both, but really one's all about identification, identity overlap, and one is about kind of a personality construct that is really about your view of the world. So narcissists are more likely to narcissistically identify with organizations. But does that help a little bit?
It just seems like work that was done in psychology 20 years ago that established that a narcissist was more likely to have these kinds of outcomes. So just keep going.
Yeah. So but I think it's an interesting point, right? At the end of the day, this question is really central though, is does understanding identity and identity overlap matter? And if the answer to that is no, well, one, a bunch of us are out of work. But I think it's a really relevant question because even the reviewers asked that in the first round was like, so what, right? So so the psychological process is taking place in their mind, but if you look at so I think to me fundamentally, I think that the understanding what's going on in people's minds are really interesting, and so if you can pull out that, if you can say this never exists, and still have the same understanding. Hey, you have a narcissist, you have them in this situation, they have to engage in that behaviors. It's true, you could still understand that, but I think just in and of itself, digging into that question is interesting. And I think it also has ramifications for then understanding behavior at a more fine-grained level. but it's a great question that we're also could ask. So. Other thoughts? Okay. And then looking at the outcomes of narcissistic identification. So as we've talked about, there's still a level of identity overlap, right? So we're still calling this a high form of organizational identification. But this is where it's a little bit unique, right? There's these self-serving behaviors. So things like nepotism, lack of openness to feedback, hubristic risk-taking, right? Organizational exploitation, theft, fraud, authoritarian leadership. So seeing the organization, when you think about, if you're Sam Walton and you see the organization as this public organization that's not really yours, although you founded it, you probably feel some level of entitlement, but you're probably going to be somewhat tempered, right, in what you're going to do. But if you really see yourself as being all about the organization, it's really free reign. Even the law, even the board, no one really has a right to tell me what to do. They don't understand the organization the same way I do. How can they really? It's really part of who I am as an individual. So with that, you're going to see these kind of behaviors that I think are somewhat shocking, right, in the media. Like, how could the person have thought that would have been okay? To the outside world, it seems obviously something that would be inappropriate, but to themselves, I don't care if the board's watching over me. What are they going to really do? And not to keep on going. I always felt scared going to the Steve Jobs example because of Jeff and the time we spent with Apple and stuff. But you think about that, and you take this individual, and all of a sudden you're in a place where this person thinks it's all about them. They can do whatever they want. They can treat the employees any way they want, and next thing you know, they're being thrown out of the organization, right? Like we saw Steve Jobs. But in their minds, it probably seemed like something that could never occur. I am Apple. How could they ever take Apple away from me or take the control away? And then on the positive outcomes as well. So, identifications associated with behavior support of the target, and this is kind of, I think, some of the things we're talking about with agency theory, I think, are a little bit nuanced. So I'm understanding where you guys are coming at with those arguments, and that's something. Isn't the narcissist always really seeing behaviors as serving themselves when they serve the organization, right? Because it's building up their own identity simultaneously, just as, a lot of these behaviors, aren't they really about, if they give a lot of effort, isn't that really going to result in a higher stock price?
Can I push back just a little bit? And I like what you're doing here. I'm not, and I'm not an agency theorist. But you're talking about them saying that in their minds, if they serve the organization, they're serving themselves. But if their compensation package was designed in a certain way, it would be true that by serving the organization, they would serve themselves. So, it wouldn't be perception, it would be reality.
So, okay, but think about, for instance, I was sitting listening to an ethics scholar the other day, and they were trying to explain the idea of, when organizations went public. And they gave the example, you have this huge, fat guy, and he has a shoe empire. And every time he's watching over all his employees. Every time he walks down the stairs to go to make a change in efficiency on the shop floor, he's going to then put 5 cents back more in his pocket, right? Or let's say however long it's ago. Maybe it's $50 back in his pocket. So it's worth it, right? Each time I do that, I'm going to see a direct benefit in my pocket. Then the organization goes public. In those small behaviors, they're not going to have the same bang for the buck, right? So as much as we try to perfectly align, and I know I'm probably getting into dangerous territory with some of you guys here, but as much as we try to align incentives, the reality is, and just like if you look in this organization here, it's not always perfectly aligned, right? There's things that people do that aren't going to directly benefit their pockets, right, or their self-interest.
Well, I'm not sure that agency theory is going to be the best predictor of this anyway, because I'm curious how many of these folks are not founders. I'm sitting here going, I think of all kinds of founders that fit this.
Yeah, but there's a ton of people too. I mean,
but non-founders, not so much. And when you got founders, they have so much stock that whatever the board does doesn't make a beans of difference anyway.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess what my challenge back to you would be is like internalize this and then start, going around your daily life and start looking at the people who are running the organizations, that you interact with, right? So, for instance, 2 schools ago, so I'm safe ground. The dean there he wasn't the founder. He came, so there was a founding group of faculty on the campus. They were all very, very involved with building the campus. They really highly identified with the organization. And then one of the young upstarts that they hired eventually became a full professor, and he became the dean of the school. And during that time, he really subsumed the identity of the business school within his own identity. In a really kind of, a lot of things he was doing on behalf of the school were amazing, and so people were saying like, oh, he thinks he can just do whatever he wants. But if you looked at the outcomes he was achieving, it was like raising rankings, bringing better recruiters, bringing money. So he was doing all these amazing things. But as he started looking at it at a really close level, there was this type of thing going on, right? So here's an example. I mean, that's just one example.
But the story you're telling is the CEO story. I mean, just.
But I mean, for all
what percentage? I mean, of CEOs do you think might fit this? I mean, we're talking 5%.
I mean, sure. That sounds about right.
Of non-founders. I mean,
okay, so
founders
I would say quite a high. I would say
non-founders.
But non-founders maybe 5 to 10%. But to me, those are the 5 and 10% that we hear about, right? So you could say, oh, they're 5%. Who cares about 5 out of 100? Well,
I do. I just don't believe it. I don't even know it's that high.
But maybe it's not. But if it's the enrons of it, right? So.
I don't want to hijack this. Can I give you one counter example and see your reaction? So the dean you were talking about, I imagine Harvard comes and offers him the deanship there, throws tons of money at him. Does he go?
Right.
If so, that sounds to me like garden variety narcissism, not narcissistic organizational identification. Because if his identity is so tied up in the school, he wouldn't go.
Well, so it's true to an extent, right? So that's one of the positive behaviors. You're going to have lower turnover. But think about the narcissist, right? So with their identity, it's subsumed within who they are, which means it's expendable, right? So I give the example of a person, right? So, hey, I have this, administrative person, their identity is subsumed with, and I know I'm using the CEO example again, but their identity is subsumed within my own. If I'm not going to be loyal to that person, I'm less likely to hire another person because I've bought into that person. They become part of my identity, but I'm not going to sacrifice necessarily my own self-interest in the long run. One example like that, where I can build my identity even more, right? So, but I think it's an interesting point that
I'm just trying to think of if I observe behavior, how could I see that this was different than?
Well, you're at BYU. I mean, so it's hard to find examples of this. No, but no, I think it's interesting. I really like kind of like where you're going with that. This idea that is it really because if they would just leave it, but going back again, like hey, it's subsumed. It's less. They see it as less than who they are. Whereas if you think about over-identification, right, I'm going to give everything on behalf of the organization. Even if I get fired, I might still, you see people all the time, right? They've been fired from an organization for 20 years and they're still jobbing how they work, but something like that. Yes. So.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Other comments? Okay. So that's the basic model there. Future directions, I think there's a lot of.
Go back to this is right on.
Yeah.
Hey, Ben,
yeah.
When you think about it, it kind of leads into future directions. I mean, I sort of see the mechanisms for CEO self-serving behaviors being different than those for organization-serving behaviors. In other words, you've got CEO narcissistic organizational identification predicting those two outcomes.
Yeah.
I almost wonder if there are different paths, theoretical and other kind of mediating paths through which CEO narcissistic organizational identification influences self-serving versus organization.
So that's a really cool idea. I mean, we really, once again, we just kind of took an initial, in the paper, we don't even actually try to talk about, so we had outcomes originally, the reviewers were like, how is this different than narcissism?
Right.
So we said, you know what, the outcomes don't even matter. It's not even about the outcomes. If you see one person, and I didn't fully agree with this, but this is kind of the decision that was made, was if you see two people and they're both going in totally different directions, or they're both doing the same thing, if you have alcohol, let's say you're studying, drunk driving, and you have one person who, drives drunk because, they're angry at the world, the other person because they're sad, does the drunk driving matter, or understanding what's kind of leading them there? So that's kind of the direction we were trying to go. We finally gave in to the reviewers, and then the last round they said, we'll bring back in those positive sides though, because that was an interesting thing. And so, but if you look at the paper now, the outcomes is really just like it's just a section of the paper. It's not like the full propositions and things like that, because like you're saying, there's a whole other, you guys are bringing up really cool stuff that are whole additional papers, right? And so I totally agree that there's unique things going on there.
To me, the empirical test would take that box and say, well, which is coming first? Because I could look at those behaviors and say that is narcissism. That's how we would define a narcissistic personality disorder. Right. So I'm not real sure that they're outcome or that they're precedent. That would be an empirical question. Yeah,
that's a great point. The other thing too is, so I think people could say like, if you see this, right, you're looking at a narcissist, so isn't that narcissism? But really, I think that's kind of the narcissism research has really been looking at things in a fairly kind of like rough grain way, right? And not really understanding what's taking place in that narcissist's mind as they're engaging in these behaviors. And that's really what it's trying to uncover.
So as a strategist, it's hard for me to
I give you that.
Outcomes always matter. And so, I'm trying to think about policy implications and the issue around outcomes. And so you have individuals who are narcissistic. They may often be founders. The fact that they are narcissistic is perhaps why they put so much into the organization to feed that, right?
Right.
And that probably is a big reason why they're successful.
Right.
We know that entrepreneurs tend to have the overconfidence bias, and also they have the I call it a personal data bias, but they call it a representativeness bias. That I believe I'm right.
Right.
That my experience trumps your large sample survey or whatever, and I'm gonna go after it. Well, that's what keeps them persistent.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I always try to.
They think they're right, and if I succeed, it does propel me out there. So on the one hand, I can imagine in stage one of a, I don't know if you want to think about an S curve, but in an early stage, founding stage or growth stage, you want narcissists, running the business, because they're going to take all the actions that are necessary to make sure that this organization succeeds, and then they benefit because
that's right.
They're so closely attached to organizational achievements, right? So I'm wondering about outcomes, and I don't know, but maybe there's just as many cases where narcissists, start businesses and it fails.
Right.
And I can
Narcissists
certainly see.
Have a hard time pivoting.
What's that?
Narcissists have a hard time pivoting. Therefore, the probability of success is probably lower with one than higher.
Because of that attachment, right?
Yeah.
So this is where I think it starts to get interesting in terms of contexts in which you want a narcissist versus when you don't. In fact, so if the narcissist happens to be right, then it's good to have a narcissist because they'll stick with it. But if they're not willing to pivot, then you don't want the narcissist. We know that having somebody run a larger organization, there's problems. You in some ways you want them to have the overconfidence bias, right, and the personal data bias when you're launching it. But once you get big, it's a problem when the CEO always thinks they're right and they're overconfident. So I'm wondering if you've thought about
so that's kind
this issue around outcomes.
That's kind of the other paper that I was talking about, and maybe we should have brought both of you on because I saw that I was approached by this paper because of my narcissism expertise, but the paper's about real options theory and and all these things. And basically, what we were saying, is that with prospect theory, you're going to escalate the commitment, but hey, what you're supposed to be doing, and actually, recently I was reading some of your stuff after we wrote this paper, and it's like, hey, you should be making these small investments, right? And so that's real, real options theory saying that. And the narcissists are instead of taking these small investments, they're like to double down, right? Mm-hmm. But in the context where they're not responsible, they're going to be more likely to then go out and do all these bold things, take the risks. it's pretty cool. So I do quite a bit of mentoring with the entrepreneurship students. We have a Lavin Center, and it's an incubator. And so there's tech people and stuff like that, but I have a pretty strong retail background. I've been involved with quite a few companies, so I get a ton of students getting sent to me. And my first thing I say is like, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. It's never going to be successful, right? And then what happens? They come back 3 months later and said, you know what, I've made so much progress. And I say, if you listen to what I'm saying, and if everyone listens to what I'm saying, no one would ever start a company. Because every idea is not really that good for a normal person's point of view. But from the narcissist, hey, I'm going to be that 1% who can make this happen. I can take it above and beyond. I have these special talents and ability. And there's a study by Wallace and Bauman. I'm not sure if I was talking to you or someone, but we usually, when we collect data with narcissism, we usually collect like high core self-alpha evaluations, which would encompass efficacy. And what we almost always, I shouldn't say always, but find above and beyond results, right? So there's something a little bit unique. So some of these things, like, hey, you need to go start up a company. If I'm highly efficacious, I'm more likely to be successful doing that. But there's some points where, that's kind of not enough. If I'm going to go ask you to do something that other people just think is impossible, that's where kind of narcissism, I think, is really like a differentiator or something that's, you think about like the president, what does it take to think you're the right I forgot about Mitt Romney, but let's just focus on Obama. But hey, I think I'm the best person in the United States to run this country, right? That's like an interesting perspective to have. That seems like something like really different than self-efficacy, or something above and beyond, I guess you could say.
I think Jeff's comments, I think are really interesting in the context of the discussion, Karana's discussion about the professionalism of management, right? Karana, wrote that book about from higher aims to, I can't remember the last part is, but basically says when, business schools started out, we were supposed to be a profession like medicine, and right. We're going to have codes of ethics, and, you have to have a body of knowledge to be, designated professional, and it's got all these advantages. But then he talks about the disadvantages because, the entrepreneurial nature is going to sort of die if everybody has to be professionalized. And what Jeff was talking about, the S-curve, I think it's kind of interesting because I thought, okay, maybe what you need to do is you have to have professional certification to be the manager of a, whatever, pick your number, a $1 billion organization. It's like up until that point, we want all these free reign folks, all these crazy ideas and starting these things. But once you're starting to, control a lot, so you could do a lot of damage.
Everything you're saying plays out perfectly in the business school that I was part of. So, for instance, there was a large group of people there who said, we're this elite group of people. We, talking to an industry like retail is below us, right? And even though we're, neighbors with Microsoft or, with Amazon and Nordstrom and all these Zoomies and on and on and on. Even though that's where we are, actually teaching something about that even if it's really at a high technology and things like that, that's way below us, right? But the narcissistic dean was like, hey, we got to be risk takers. If you ever want to be anything but a small campus, we got to run and do this and try new things and take risks. But that might not be the person you'd want running a large business school who, is very well established. There's a huge legacy and things like that. So I think that's right on. I don't know if that's kind of what you're.
Our argument, Nathan and ours, is that basically you need a different style of management for a low uncertainty problem, which is what established organizations tend to. You already have customers, you're getting feedback, you're getting incremental. We want this change, but it all tends to be very incremental and. Right. The problems that are being thrown at you are relatively low uncertainty. Whereas if you're trying to create something new, a brand new product, brand new service, not been done before, a lot of uncertainty, you need a different style of management.
And I think one thing,
different management principles.
And so it may very well be that the notions of professionalism, it's like you don't really want that at the beginning, but there comes a point where you want that for that kind of problem. Yeah.
And I think the one thing I always try to be careful with is because whenever I present this kind of research, next thing it's like narcissism's everywhere, right? Where has this hammer. I mean, you can tell stories like that we're talking about here and leave narcissism completely out of the story, and it still makes a lot of sense, right? But this is one perspective, one approach to understanding a lot of these kind of interesting phenomena.
Sorry, one more thing, if I may.
Yeah.
I was having the same kind of thought that John was at the end there. as you talk about, passing into the behaviors, and I think this unifies back to what the agency theory says. See, I think that the behaviors happen to the degree that agency theory allows them, right? Agency governance mechanisms ought to be in place to prevent the bad behaviors and promote the good behaviors. And to the degree that those governance mechanisms are ineffective or fail, they would allow the self-serving behaviors. The challenge is they may have a hard time separating them. What I think you're doing that agency theory doesn't do at all is explain where the self-interested, opportunistic behavior comes from.
Right.
So Oliver Williamson was fond of saying opportunists are out there, and he kind of leaned forward to say, it's not you, it's not me, but it's that guy out there. And if I don't have to know who it is, I just have to know there's a risk.
Out there,
You're starting to explain the mechanisms that define the opportunistic behavior. That person who would act on their own to the detriment of an organization. And unfortunately, part of the time, it would be hard to separate the two.
Right.
So I think in some sense, one of the things that's passing between the organizational identification and the behaviors is the agency theory. And you're trying to explain the antecedents of the opportunist that we actually invite in, the sheep and wolf slogan, from an agency theory
We need to diversify our reviewer pools, huh?
But that's part of the challenge is the predictive model, because it's like, I don't know when a narcissist is good or bad in terms of being able to predict.
And this doesn't
influence on.
This doesn't say that.
Performance. It could be great. It could be terrible.
In the future discussions, we'll get into this a little bit. But hey, what can boards do to rein this in, right? So they can take the positive side and then pull back on the downside. But here, just for those of you who are interested, could you ever measure something like this? Jeff was going to talk about, you could do like a diagram type thing where, hey, which circles look. So I've done that with traditional organizational identification, but which circles tend to kind of, depict, your level of identification and get at some of this. At one point we had, all forms of, between over and narcissistic and everything in between on one diagram and how you could look at it and pick, but it just got too convoluted. This is a really simple idea, just to take the Mill and Ashforth model and then kind of put it. So for instance, when someone criticizes insert name of organization, it feels like a personal insult. That would be high organizational and conventional. When someone criticizes insert name of the organization, it feels like a personal insult because they're criticizing me. Or when I talk about insert name of the organization, I usually say I rather than we or they, whereas this is we. So you can see how you could tweak it. Obviously, you need to do, scale development and things like that.
The work, everything I've seen on CEO narcissism uses third-party sources to identify it.
So
do you think you could do that with
those are the strategies. So our CEO research, we actually have self-report using the Raskin and Terry measure. The Chatterjee and Hamburg stuff, I think, it's interesting. So, hey, you have this gigantic picture in the, annual report. Does that really mean the person's narcissistic? I don't know. They obviously had a say on the size of the picture, but there could have been this, over anxious, so their measures are very rough, I'll just say that. And I don't know if going forward or if you had OB reviewers or whatever, if it would fly, right? So I think it's good that our field allows different fields to have basic assumptions, right? So, hey, I can use these proxies to then determine if they're narcissistic. I'm glad that the reviewers allowed them to do that because it pushed for some really interesting ideas. But did they really capture whether or not the CEO is narcissistic? I don't think so. So it's it's an interesting thing to think about. But I was just in the academy meeting the other day where someone said, oh, I used to help write those, and the CEO was involved in every minute detail, and but is really every CEO have time to work anyway? So there's a lot of questions that can be raised with that. So, but the research I do is mainly self-report using the Raskin and Terry measure. It's old, psychology, NPI stuff, so from the 80s, and then they've gone to a short scale more recently. But, okay. And then how would you empirically do this? So looking at things like founder status, governance controls that allow for CEO autonomy, CEO financial ownership of the firm, CEO tenure, positive financial firm performance, positive press coverage. So instead of these kind of abstract ideas like others are attributing, positive things to you, we could actually just look at positive press coverage and things like that. So these are some ways to actually empirically. We've talked about the other levels and targets and things like that pretty extensively, but I think that it is interesting. Hopefully, people will say, hey, this is like applicable to more than just CEOs. You can take this, this idea that the identity is being subsumed with another identity, and look at totally different contexts, right? So a manager with a group of a team, or a person with an individual, or some stuff like that. Family plus or minus. So in most examples we've been looking at, family is probably a really bad thing, right? Your father or mother, who was the founder of the organization, is doing this. As you become more and more involved in the organization, right? It just becomes this we that's not really the we as in the shareholders. It's the we as in the family. So can the family as a collective subsume the identity of the organization within their family? Is a definite possibility. But I think kind of a cool thing, though, is that if you look at an organization like Nordstrom, I spent quite a bit of time studying, and we had the opportunity to interact, or I had the opportunity to interact with quite a bit. You look at, the Bruce Nordstrom, he wrote this book. It's like, this is the comments about his sons who are now running the organization, right? They all have a pride and a loyalty to the family and the reputation, and will never do anything to besmirch that reputation. In fact, they want to improve it, right? So they're actually, the family's going to reduce the tendencies for these individuals to then narcissistically identify. They're going to bring them in to the Nordstrom family. They start working there when you're 12. A lot of humility. And I was at the shareholders meeting, I believe it was in 2013, and one of the sons, he continually saying your organization, talking to the shareholders, right? Because what could we, you start thinking about what does it sound like when he's saying we? We. It sounds like the Nordstrom brothers, right? It doesn't sound like the we as in the Nordstrom family and all of the shareholders. So they adopted the term your, right? Even though they obviously own a large portion of the organization. And then as far as like practical, implications, this idea is, it's important understanding self-focus, but this whole idea of spiraling out of control. So a little bit might be okay, but then, these things can quickly go crazy, right? Where all of a sudden, really serious negative things are happening in the organization. Creating a greater accountability to board and shareholders and stakeholders. So if you can pull back on some of these antecedent factors that lead them. So as you're talking about the organization, ensuring that, the organization is always referenced to as, when you're doing press releases. So for instance, you don't say Steve Jobs or, things like that. You say Apple or other examples. But also just in their perceived ownership. So I sat on a board. The University of Washington has a chain of stores. So there's, I think, 7 stores, and it's about a $50 million business. So I was on the board for that up in Washington. They expect a faculty member to do that. And on that, it was pretty interesting to see the CEO had really kind of taken the reins, and he saw it as his organization and things like that. And as board members, they were kind of at the mercy of the CEO. So the CEO actually passed away, and in that transition, they basically said, hey, we need to take back control of this organization so what happened last time doesn't happen again. And there was so much conversation, like there were lots of signals, right? This isn't your organization. The board is actually, a governing body here. You can't just do whatever you want, hey, let's start hiring people from outside the organization, not just from within. Things like that. They were signaling to the person that would limit the tendency for this to occur. And then I think, just in closing here, this idea that, you take a narcissistic individual like Steve Jobs, full of potential, has all these amazing ideas. How do you kind of get the most out of Steve Jobs? What can the organizations, what can the boards be doing? And some of the actions, obviously, that the Apple board did were extreme, and you could maybe say, hey, those were bad moves. In thinking, I don't necessarily agree with it at all. But if you look at the ultimate impact, Steve kind of emerged from that a somewhat different person. Although he was probably still narcissistic, and this is Brad Owen's research, but there might have been a level of humility there too. And I'll let Brad explain whether or not, you could be narcissistic and humble at the same time. But this idea of these productive narcissists, right? This idea that you could have a person who has these tendencies but learns to really control them. As I work with MBAs, that's one of the things that comes up a lot, right? So you have these people in the classroom who are kind of these out of control narcissists. As you're working with them, how do you help to coach them so that they can become these productive narcissists, right? A higher level of humility, really able to see the world from a more realistic point of view that then allows them to go on and do these great things. So that's some ideas. Any questions?
Yeah, And then I've heard it said that all research is autobiographical.
So people only say autobiographical when it's something bad, but they actually say it's something that you aren't. So if I present on leadership, everyone says, I heard, you always research the thing you're ineffective at, right? So, no, but I think there's an interesting point there that, and this is in no way meant to be a critique, and I've talked about this in a few of my interviews, because the church does such a good job of making us feel extremely self-confident and special. When my seminary students leave the classroom every day, they're like, cloud nine, and they're amazing, and they're going to go conquer the world. But at the same time, are we creating a level of arrogance? So how do we temper that, right? And so, I don't want to go into, all the many things the church does to try to keep us humble and, prayer and, honor, all those things. But it's interesting to think about. I think I've felt, I'm now married and my wife is in charge, and I've been very humbled through having children and things like that. But I think there was probably a time where, when I was at BYU, I thought I was going to go out and, be a big CEO and do all these amazing things. And then, through life and kind of a change of perspective and things like that, some of that changed. So I know it was kind of probably meant to ingest, but I think there is an element to that. And it's also being around a lot of people and being very observant, that I've just seen this play out over and over again when I've been part of things where you see the person suddenly, you realize, like, you're not really part of what they're seeing here. They're really, like, in their mind, we're just kind of these tools in their frame. So I know it's a joke, so I probably shared too much there.
I mean, I was interested in your slide on does family kind of rein this in or
right.
Make it worse? And I'm curious, is there research on this, on how narcissists perceive their family? Is the family kind of an exception to the narcissism, or have you seen anything?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, when I first started doing narcissism research, I felt like I knew all the studies. And I mean, not going back to all this, I'm talking about in management. In fact, our study was probably in PSYCH was one of the first top, high-level journals that was really that hitting in that topic. And now it's just gone crazy. So it's hard for me to keep up on everything, and especially that would almost, so one of the reasons I reached out, so the story behind this paper is I had this idea I was working on another paper, and I thought this is a really cool idea, and I love working with Don Lane because I think he's just super fun to write with and he's super brilliant. And I called him and I said, Don, I've got this really, really cool idea. Let me explain it to you. And he's more like an OT guy, and he said, you're just talking about over-identification. And he's like, I'm really busy right now. So then I called Blake. And I said, hey, Blake, I've got this really cool idea. Do you want to be on this paper? And Blake said, yeah. So then I called back Don and said, Blake thinks it's a really cool idea. Now, do you want to be on the paper? He said, I've been dying to work with Blake. I'll be on the paper. So that's kind of this was, obviously at the beginning. But that's, but my point in telling that story is that there's a lot of cross-level, a lot of stuff is getting into more strategy research. And that happens sometimes at CEO research, but at the end of the day, I see myself as more of a micro person. So sometimes I miss out on some, let's say, family research and things like that. But as I talk to people doing that type of research, I start to see, wow, there's so much overlap with all this stuff. So I'm not sure, though. Make a long story short.
The other thing I found interesting, especially with Peter's example, is, we've always thought of this concept of identification as cementing you with the organization.
Right.
But the way you talked about it, it's almost as if this narcissistic sense of identification lessens your actual sense of identification.
Yeah.
And so there's just an interesting, I don't know.
Yeah, that's something we didn't even talk about at all in the paper, and it might be, I think it's probably too late at this point to try to add that in, but it's really, it's really cool. I've wanted to add in a bunch more stuff, and they're like, no, you can't do it. And before we send it back to the, the action, because it was really we did it in a week, a few days. It was just really straightforward stuff. All the reviewers were fine with it. But that's cool that what you're talking about. So, other questions, comments? All right. You guys have